The holidays in Black households during the 1960s through 1980s meant something extraordinary. Tables overflowing with dishes passed down through generations, kitchens filled with the aroma of slow-cooked traditions, and recipes that held the history of families who turned simple ingredients into culinary masterpieces. These weren't just meals. They were acts of love, cultural preservation, and community celebration. Grandmothers, mothers, and aunts spent days preparing feasts that brought everyone together, creating memories that would last lifetimes. But many of these beloved holiday dishes have quietly disappeared from modern tables. What happened to the foods that once defined Black family celebrations? And why do they hold such powerful meaning for those who remember them? Here are 25 holiday foods that Black families cherished during those decades. Dishes that are now rare or forgotten entirely. 1. Ambrosia salad. Ambrosia salad was the crown jewel of holiday dessert tables in Black households during the 1970s. This wasn't your average fruit salad. It was a carefully layered creation of mandarin oranges, pineapple chunks, miniature marshmallows, shredded coconut, maraschino cherries, and sour cream or Cool Whip, all mixed together in a large glass bowl that sat proudly on the buffet table. The sweetness was almost overwhelming, but that was exactly the point. Kids would hover around the table, waiting for permission to dig in, and adults would serve themselves generous portions alongside their main course, treating it as both side dish and dessert. The preparation of ambrosia was a ritual. Grandmothers would drain the canned fruits meticulously, ensuring no excess liquid would water down the creamy mixture. They'd fold the ingredients with a gentle hand, creating layers of color and texture that looked beautiful through the glass bowl. This dish represented abundance and celebration. Ingredients like canned pineapple and coconut were considered special purchases, not everyday items, for families who remembered harder times. Being able to serve ambrosia meant prosperity and plenty. Today, ambrosia salad has largely disappeared from holiday tables, dismissed by younger generations as too sweet or old-fashioned. But for those who remember, it represents more than just a sugary side dish. It was a taste of celebration, the visual centerpiece of abundance, and a reminder of grandmothers who knew how to make ordinary ingredients feel extraordinary. 2. Divinity candy. Divinity candy was the ultimate test of a cook's skill in Black households during the holidays. This ethereal white confection, made from sugar, corn syrup, egg whites, and vanilla, required perfect weather conditions, precise timing, and a practiced hand. Aunties would start making divinity days before Christmas, checking the humidity and temperature because even slight moisture in the air could ruin an entire batch. The candy had to be beaten to stiff peaks, then dropped onto wax paper in clouds of white sweetness, often studded with pecans or walnuts that added crunch to the pillowy texture. The kitchen would transform during divinity-making sessions. The smell of boiling sugar filled the air, and younger family members would be warned not to disturb the cook during the critical beating stage. Successful divinity was a source of pride. Smooth, glossy mounds that held their shape and melted on the tongue. Failed batches became family jokes, sticky messes that had to be scraped off the pan and discarded. Grandmothers who could make perfect divinity every time earned legendary status in their communities. This candy has nearly vanished from holiday traditions, partly because it's so temperamental to make, and partly because modern preferences lean toward chocolate and richer confections. But divinity represented something important: the mastery of a difficult skill, the patience required for traditional cooking methods, and the pride of presenting something homemade and beautiful to guests. Each piece was a small work of art, and making it successfully was a point of honor. 3. 7-Up Pound Cake. The 7-Up Pound Cake was a staple at every holiday gathering in Black households during the 1970s and early 1980s. This wasn't just any pound cake. It was dense, buttery, and incredibly moist, with a subtle citrus flavor that came from using a full bottle of 7-Up soda in the batter. Grandmothers and mothers would pull out their heavy tube pans, grease them meticulously, and carefully measure out a pound each of butter, sugar, and flour, plus 6 eggs and that crucial bottle of soda. The cake would bake for over an hour, filling the house with an aroma that announced celebration and plenty. The texture of this cake was unmatched. Each slice was tender yet firm, with a tight golden crumb that stayed fresh for days. Families would serve it plain, dusted with powdered sugar, or with a simple glaze. It appeared at Christmas dinners, New Year's celebrations, and every holiday in between. The cake was often the centerpiece of dessert tables, cut into thick slices and served on good china. Kids would beg for the end pieces with their extra crusty edges, and adults would praise the baker's skill. Today, the 7-Up pound cake has been largely replaced by box mixes and bakery cakes. The time investment, the careful creaming of butter and sugar, the patient folding in of ingredients, the long baking time, doesn't fit modern rush schedules. But this cake represented more than convenience. It was proof of a cook's dedication and skill. Making a perfect pound cake from scratch was a badge of honor, and the recipe was often a closely guarded family secret, passed down through generations with small variations that made each family's version unique. 4. Chitlins or chitlins were both loved and controversial in Black households during the holidays. These were pork intestines that required hours of intensive cleaning and preparation, then slow cooking until tender. The process was laborious, soaking, scraping, turning inside out, and washing multiple times to remove any trace of impurity. The smell during cooking was distinctive and strong, often filling the entire house and sometimes the neighborhood. Yet for many Black families, particularly those with roots in the South, chitlins were an essential holiday tradition that connected them to their ancestors and cultural heritage. Families would gather in kitchens to help with the cleaning process, with experienced cooks teaching younger generations the proper technique. Once cleaned and cooked, chitlins were served with hot sauce, vinegar, and saltine crackers. Some families made chitlin sandwiches, while others served them as a side dish. The taste was rich and distinctive, with a texture that was both tender and slightly chewy. Men often claimed special authority over chitlin preparation, debating the perfect cooking time and seasoning blend. Chitlins have largely disappeared from modern holiday tables, as younger generations often reject the intensive labor and strong smell. Health concerns and changing dietary preferences have also contributed to their decline. But for those who remember, chitlins represented resilience and resourcefulness. Enslaved ancestors had transformed parts of the pig that slaveholders discarded into a delicacy. Serving chitlins during the holidays was an act of cultural preservation, a way of honoring history and maintaining connection to Southern roots. The dish carried stories of survival, creativity, and the refusal to forget where families came from. 5. Neck bones. Neck bones were a holiday staple in Black households throughout the 1960s and 1970s, particularly among families who appreciated the rich, flavorful dishes that came from slow-cooking, less expensive cuts of meat. These pork neck bones would simmer for hours in a large pot with onions, garlic, bay leaves, and spices, creating a gravy so rich and deeply flavored that it became the star of the meal. The meat would fall off the bone, tender and succulent, and families would serve neck bones over rice or with cornbread to soak up every drop of that precious gravy. Preparing neck bones was an all-day affair. Grandmothers would start early in the morning, browning the bones first to seal in flavor, then adding vegetables and liquid for the long, slow braise. The kitchen would fill with an aroma that signaled celebration and comfort. Children would peek into the pot throughout the day, watching the transformation of tough bones into fall-apart tenderness. At dinner, everyone knew the technique, holding the bone and carefully working the meat free with teeth and fork, savoring every morsel and making sure not to waste a single bite. These humble neck bones have largely vanished from holiday menus as Black families' economic circumstances improved and tastes shifted toward premium cuts. But neck bones represented something profound: the ability of Black cooks to transform the cheapest ingredients into something delicious and satisfying. They were a testament to culinary skill and creativity born from necessity, and they connected families to their history. The dish required time, patience, and knowledge passed down through generations, values that increasingly seem at odds with modern food culture. 6. Pig's feet. Pig's feet, also called trotters, were a traditional holiday dish in many black households, particularly among families with strong Southern connections. These gelatinous, collagen-rich parts of the pig would be cleaned thoroughly, then simmered for hours until tender, often pickled in vinegar and spices, or braised in a flavorful sauce. The result was an acquired taste. The texture was unique, somewhere between tender meat and soft cartilage, and the flavor was rich and porky. Families would serve pig's feet with hot sauce, vinegar, and saltines, or as part of a larger soul food spread. The preparation of pig's feet was a skill that older family members took seriously. They'd inspect each piece carefully, ensuring proper cleaning and preparation. Some families preferred their pig's feet pickled, pulling them from jars that had been prepared weeks in advance. Others braised them fresh with onions, garlic, and bell peppers until the skin was soft and the meat fell away from the small bones. Men often claimed special appreciation for this dish, and debates about the best preparation method could last throughout the meal. Pig's feet have become increasingly rare on holiday tables as dietary preferences have changed and younger generations have moved away from these traditional preparations. The labor-intensive preparation and unusual texture have made them less appealing to modern cooks. But pig's feet carried deep cultural significance. They represented the ingenuity of enslaved ancestors who created meaningful meals from discarded parts, and they connected families to their rural Southern heritage. Serving pig's feet during holidays was an act of remembrance and cultural pride, a way of saying that no part of the family's history would be forgotten or dismissed. 7. Head cheese. Head cheese, despite its name, was a traditional meat jelly made from the head of a pig, including the meat from the skull, tongue, and sometimes feet, all boiled down until the collagen created a natural gelatin. This dish appeared on holiday tables in black households where older family members maintained connections to rural Southern foodways. The preparation was intensive, cleaning and boiling the pig's head, picking all the usable meat, seasoning it generously with spices, then allowing it to cool and set into a firm loaf that could be sliced and served cold. The texture and appearance of head cheese made it controversial even within families. The jellied meat had a distinctive look. Chunks of meat suspended in translucent gel, sliced thin, and served on crackers or bread with mustard and pickles. Older generations considered it a delicacy, a showcase of culinary skill and nose-to-tail cooking. They'd serve it with pride during holiday gatherings, often alongside other traditional dishes. Younger family members might eye it suspiciously, but respect for elders meant at least trying a small portion. Head cheese has virtually disappeared from modern black holiday tables, replaced by more conventional deli meats and appetizers. The labor involved and the unfamiliar appearance have made it unappealing to contemporary cooks and diners. Yet head cheese represented ultimate resourcefulness and culinary expertise, the ability to transform every part of an animal into something edible and even prized. It connected families to their ancestors' survival skills and to a time when wasting food was unthinkable. Those who remember eating head cheese during holidays recall not just the taste, but the reverence with which it was prepared and served, and the cultural knowledge it represented. 8. Homemade eggnog. Homemade eggnog in black households during the 1970s was a completely different creation from the store-bought version. This was thick, rich, and potent, made from scratch with fresh eggs, heavy cream, whole milk, sugar, vanilla, and a generous pour of whiskey, rum, or brandy. The adults-only version was kept separate from the children's alcohol-free batch. Both served in special punch bowls or glass pitchers reserved specifically for the holidays. Grandmothers and aunties would begin preparing eggnog days before Christmas, allowing the flavors to meld and develop in the refrigerator. The process of making eggnog was ceremonial. Eggs would be separated, whites beaten to soft peaks, yolks whisked with sugar until pale and thick. The dairy would be warmed with spices, nutmeg, cinnamon, sometimes vanilla bean. Everything would be folded together carefully, with alcohol added last, and tasted repeatedly to ensure the proper strength. The eggnog would be served in small crystal cups or punch glasses, with extra nutmeg grated fresh on top. Adults would sip it slowly while visiting, and the rich drink would leave a coating on the tongue that lasted through conversations. Homemade eggnog has become rare as families rely on store-bought versions or skip it entirely. The raw eggs worry modern cooks, the alcohol content seems excessive, and the time investment doesn't fit contemporary schedules. But homemade eggnog was more than a drink. It was a symbol of hospitality and abundance, proof that the household could afford quality ingredients and take time for proper preparation. The recipe was often closely guarded, with each family swearing their proportions were superior. The adults who gathered over eggnog were participating in a ritual of celebration and connection that helped define the holiday season. 9. Coconut cake. The coconut cake that graced Black holiday tables during the 1970s was a towering masterpiece. 3 or 4 layers of moist white cake held together with a rich, creamy frosting and completely covered in freshly grated coconut. This wasn't a simple dessert. It was an architectural achievement that required skill, patience, and usually an entire afternoon. Grandmothers would crack fresh coconuts, carefully extracting the meat and grating it by hand until their arms ached. The cake layers had to be perfectly level, the frosting smooth and stable enough to hold that heavy coating of coconut without sliding off. The preparation involved multiple steps spread across hours or even days. The cake layers would be baked and cooled, often wrapped and refrigerated overnight to make them easier to handle. The frosting, usually a buttercream or a special cooked frosting that set firm, would be made fresh, beaten until light and fluffy. Then came the assembly, spreading frosting between layers, covering the entire cake smoothly, and finally pressing handfuls of coconut onto every surface. The finished cake would sit on a special cake stand, often under a glass dome, looking magnificent and beckoning from its place of honor on the dessert table. Coconut cake has become less common as the labor involved seems excessive to modern bakers, who can buy similar cakes at bakeries. Fresh coconut is harder to find and more expensive, and the multiple steps require expertise that's no longer commonly passed down. But this cake represented dedication and love. Hours of work transformed into something beautiful and delicious. Grandmothers who could make a perfect coconut cake earned legendary status in their communities. The cake was often saved for the most special occasions, and getting a thick slice with plenty of coconut was a treasure treat. It symbolized the care families put into holiday celebrations and the pride they took in presenting something truly special. 10. Watergate salad. Watergate salad appeared at Black holiday gatherings throughout the 1970s and early 1980s as a trendy, modern dish that still honored the tradition of creamy, sweet salads on the dessert table. This bright green concoction combined pistachio instant pudding mix, crushed pineapple, miniature marshmallows, chopped nuts, and Cool Whip, creating a fluffy, sweet side dish that was somewhere between salad and dessert. The color alone made it distinctive, that artificial pistachio green announcing its presence from across the room. Kids loved its sweet, creamy texture and the fun of finding marshmallows hidden throughout. Making Watergate salad was easy compared to more elaborate dishes, which partially explained its popularity among younger cooks and busy mothers who still wanted to contribute something homemade to holiday meals. The ingredients were mixed in one bowl, refrigerated to set, and served cold. It became a conversation piece. Guests would ask about the name, debate whether it was a salad or dessert, and reminisce about similar dishes their own families made. Some families added their own touches, extra nuts, or different fruits, making the basic recipe their own. Watergate salad has faded from holiday tables, as food trends have moved away from processed ingredients and marshmallow-heavy dishes. The bright, artificial color and reliance on instant pudding mix make it seem dated to contemporary tastes. But this dish represented a specific moment in American food culture, when convenience foods were celebrated and innovations, like instant pudding, were considered modern and exciting. 4 Black families serving Watergate salad showed they were current with food trends while still honoring the tradition of elaborate holiday spreads. It was affordable, crowd-pleasing, and easy to transport to potlucks and family gatherings, qualities that made it perfect for its era. 11. Red velvet cake from scratch. The red velvet cake that appeared on black holiday tables during the 1960s and 1970s was a labor of love made entirely from scratch. No box mixes, no shortcuts. This version had a subtle chocolate flavor, a tender crumb, and that distinctive red color that came from a chemical reaction between buttermilk, vinegar, and cocoa powder, though some cooks added red food coloring for extra drama. The cake was always layered, usually 3 tiers, filled and frosted with homemade cream cheese frosting or ermine frosting that was beaten until fluffy and spread thick between layers and over the entire cake. Baking red velvet from scratch required precision and skill. The batter had to be mixed in a specific order, creaming butter and sugar until light, adding eggs one at a time, alternating dry ingredients with buttermilk, then carefully folding in the cocoa mixture and food coloring at the end. The layers had to bake evenly and cool completely before frosting. Experienced bakers knew that room temperature ingredients and gentle mixing were crucial for the fine, velvety texture that gave the cake its name. The finished product was stunning. Deep red layers separated by white frosting, the color contrast making it a showpiece. Today, most red velvet cakes come from box mixes or bakeries, and the from-scratch tradition has largely disappeared. Modern versions often lack the subtle chocolate flavor and rely heavily on food coloring alone. But the homemade red velvet cake of past decades represented excellence in baking and the willingness to invest time in creating something special. It was reserved for the most important celebrations, and the baker who could produce a perfect red velvet cake earned respect and admiration. The cake symbolized sophistication, skill, and the importance of the occasion. It announced that this holiday gathering was worthy of the very best the family could offer. 12. Oyster dressing. Oyster dressing was a luxurious holiday tradition in black households, particularly among families with connections to coastal regions or Creole cooking traditions. This wasn't ordinary cornbread dressing. It was elevated with fresh or canned oysters mixed into the cornbread, celery, onions, and spices, then baked until golden on top and moist inside. The oysters added a briny richness and a tender texture that contrasted beautifully with the crispy edges of the dressing. For families who served it, oyster dressing was as essential to the holiday meal as turkey or ham. The preparation involved both cornbread and oyster expertise. Cooks would bake fresh cornbread days before, allowing it to dry out slightly for better texture in the dressing. On the day of preparation, they'd saute vegetables in butter, crumble the cornbread, add the oysters with their precious liquor, season generously, and moisten everything with broth and butter. The dressing would go into the oven in a large pan, where it would bake until the edges were crispy and golden while the interior stayed moist. Some families used fresh oysters from the fish market, others relied on canned. But both versions were treated with reverence. Oyster dressing has become rare on modern holiday tables, partly due to the expense of oysters and partly because younger generations are less familiar with cooking seafood. The taste can be an acquired one, and families have gradually shifted toward more universally accepted cornbread or bread-based dressings. But oyster dressing represented cultural sophistication and connection to coastal Southern and Creole culinary traditions. It showed that black holiday cooking wasn't monolithic, but included regional variations and family specialties. For those who grew up with it, oyster dressing was irreplaceable. The taste of home and tradition, a dish that announced the holidays had arrived. 13. Fruitcake homemade. The homemade fruitcake that black families prepared during the holidays was a completely different creation from the commercial versions that became the butt of jokes in later years. These were dense, moist loaves packed with dried fruits that had been soaked in rum or brandy for weeks, combined with nuts, spices, and just enough batter to hold everything together. The cakes were baked slowly, then wrapped in cheesecloth soaked in more alcohol and aged for weeks or even months before serving. Each slice was rich and intense, meant to be eaten in small portions with coffee or tea. The preparation of fruitcake was a ritual that began weeks before Christmas. Fruits would be chopped and soaked in alcohol, with family members checking and adding more liquid as needed. The smell of rum-soaked raisins, cherries, and citron would fill the kitchen. When baking day arrived, the fruits would be drained, coated in flour to prevent sinking, and folded into a spiced batter enriched with butter and eggs. The cakes would bake for hours, filling the house with the aroma of cinnamon, nutmeg, and allspice. After cooling, they'd be wrapped carefully and stored in a cool place, with a baker checking them weekly and adding more alcohol to keep them moist. Homemade fruitcake has virtually disappeared, replaced by commercial versions or skipped entirely as younger generations reject the intense flavor and alcoholic content. The weeks-long preparation time seems excessive in modern life, and the taste strong, spiced, and boozy doesn't appeal to contemporary palates accustomed to lighter, sweeter desserts. But homemade fruitcake represented patience, planning, and tradition. It was a link to British and colonial baking traditions that Black families had made their own, and it symbolized the care families took in preparing for celebrations. A properly aged fruitcake was a point of pride, and offering guests a slice meant welcoming them with the family's finest. 14. Giblet gravy. Giblet gravy was essential to holiday meals in Black households. Made from the turkey or chicken giblets, the heart, liver, gizzard, and neck that came inside the bird. This wasn't the smooth, simple gravy of modern times. It was thick, richly flavored, and studded with chopped cooked giblets that added texture and deep, meaty flavor. Grandmothers would simmer the giblets for hours in water seasoned with onion, celery, and herbs, creating a rich broth that would become the base for gravy. Once the giblets were tender, they'd be chopped fine and stirred back into the gravy along with pan drippings from the roasted bird. Making giblet gravy required skill and attention. The giblets had to be cleaned properly and simmered until tender without becoming tough. The gravy had to be whisked constantly to prevent lumps, with flour or cornstarch added gradually until it reached the perfect consistency. Thick enough to coat the back of a spoon but pourable. Seasoning was crucial: salt, pepper, sage, and sometimes a splash of sherry or wine. The finished gravy would be kept warm on the stove, ready to be ladled generously over turkey, dressing, rice, and biscuits. There was never enough. Family members would request extra gravy like it was liquid gold. Giblet gravy has become less common as many people find the organ meats unappealing, and modern cooks opt for simpler gravies made just from pan drippings and broth. The giblets are often discarded or saved for pets rather than being transformed into gravy. But giblet gravy represented the principle of using every part of the bird, wasting nothing. It carried the most intense, genuine flavor of the holiday meal, and it connected families to cooking traditions that valued resourcefulness and deep flavor. Those who remember giblet gravy recall how it transformed a plate of food, adding richness and substance that made the entire meal more satisfying. 15. Pineapple upside-down cake. Pineapple upside-down cake was a showstopper dessert that appeared at Black holiday celebrations throughout the 1970s. Its caramelized pineapple rings and bright red maraschino cherries creating a beautiful pattern when the cake was flipped from the pan. This dessert was made in cast iron skillets or special cake pans, with butter and brown sugar melted in the bottom. Pineapple rings arranged in a perfect pattern, cherries placed in centers, then yellow cake batter poured over everything. When baked and inverted, the result was stunning. Golden cake topped with gleaming caramelized fruit that looked almost too pretty to cut. The drama of making pineapple upside-down cake was part of its appeal. Kids would gather around as their mother or grandmother carefully arranged the pineapple rings, making sure each one was positioned perfectly. The cherries had to be dried thoroughly so they'd stay in place. The batter was poured carefully to avoid disturbing the fruit arrangement. After baking, there was always a suspenseful moment when the cake was inverted. Would it release cleanly, or would the fruit stick to the pan? A successful flip, with all the fruit intact and glistening, earned applause from everyone watching. Pineapple upside-down cake has faded from holiday tables as tastes have shifted toward chocolate desserts and more elaborate creations. The sweet simplicity and retro aesthetic don't appeal to modern preferences the way they once did. But this cake represented approachable elegance. It was impressive to look at but straightforward to make, requiring no special decorating skills. It was democratic and welcoming, a dessert that said celebration, without being pretentious. The combination of buttery cake and caramelized fruit was comforting and nostalgic, and serving it meant honoring a tradition of making ordinary ingredients look extraordinary. 16. Pickled beets. Pickled beets were a traditional side dish that appeared on Black holiday tables. Their deep purple-red color and sweet, tangy flavor adding contrast to richer dishes. These weren't fresh beets hastily prepared. They were beets that had been boiled until tender, peeled, sliced, and packed into jars with a pickling liquid of vinegar, sugar, spices, and sometimes onions, then left to cure for weeks. The result was tender, flavorful beets with a bright, acidic kick that cut through the richness of holiday meats and gravies. They'd be served in small dishes, their juice staining everything they touched that distinctive magenta color. The preparation of pickled beets was often a multi-generational activity. Older women would oversee the process, teaching daughters and granddaughters the proper way to boil beets, with the skins on to preserve color. Slip the skins off when still warm, and the right proportions for the pickling liquid. The beets would be packed into mason jars, the spiced vinegar poured over them, and the jars processed in a water bath to seal properly. They'd be stored in the pantry or basement, the jars lined up like jewels, ready to be opened during the holidays. The cook who made excellent pickled beets was valued, as this preservation skill was becoming less common even then. Pickled beets have largely disappeared from modern holiday meals, as families rely more on fresh vegetables and fewer preserved foods. The labor involved in canning and the distinctive flavor don't appeal to contemporary tastes. Many younger people have never even tried pickled beets. But these preserved vegetables represented self-sufficiency and connection to agricultural traditions. They showed that the family had planned ahead, put up food during harvest season, and maintained the preservation skills that had helped earlier generations survive. Opening a jar of homemade pickled beets during the holidays meant bringing forward the work and wisdom of previous months, a tangible link between seasons and generations. 17. Sweet potato pie with homemade crust. Sweet potato pie with homemade crust was a crown jewel of Black holiday dessert tables during the 1960s and 1970s, completely different from pumpkin pie and infinitely more prized in Black households. The filling was made from fresh sweet potatoes that had been baked until soft, then mashed and combined with butter, eggs, sugar, evaporated milk, vanilla, cinnamon, and nutmeg. The mixture was smooth, creamy, and deeply flavored. But what really mattered was the crust. Rolled out from scratch, flaky and tender, crimped beautifully around the edges, and baked until golden. This wasn't a dessert made from canned filling. It was an achievement of skill and tradition. The preparation started with selecting the right sweet potatoes, not too large, with deep orange flesh that promised rich flavor and color. They'd be baked until caramelized and tender, then the flesh scooped out while still hot and mashed smooth. Experienced cooks knew to taste the filling before baking, adjusting sugar and spices to account for the sweetness of the potatoes. The pie would bake until just set, still slightly jiggly in the center, then cool to room temperature, which was when the texture would firm perfectly. Some families topped theirs with meringue, while others served it plain or with a dollop of whipped cream. Today, many sweet potato pies are made with store-bought crusts or even purchased entirely from bakeries. The from-scratch tradition has eroded as people lose confidence in making pastry and as pre-made options become more acceptable. But the homemade sweet potato pie represented culinary pride and African-American foodways that differed from mainstream American traditions. Pumpkin pie was what white families served. Sweet potato pie was a cultural marker, a statement of identity. The time invested in peeling and baking sweet potatoes, making pastry from scratch, and carefully mixing the filling showed dedication to tradition and excellence. Each slice was a taste of heritage and home. 18. Baked ham with pineapple and cloves. The holiday ham in Black households during the 1970s was an elaborate presentation. A whole bone-in ham studded with whole cloves in a perfect diamond pattern, covered with pineapple rings secured with toothpicks, and glazed with a mixture of brown sugar, honey, mustard, and pineapple juice. The ham would bake for hours, with the glaze applied repeatedly to create a thick, caramelized coating that was both sweet and tangy. The kitchen would fill with an intoxicating aroma of smoked pork, caramelizing sugar, and tropical fruit. When brought to the table, the ham was a centerpiece, golden, gleaming, and beautiful. Preparing the ham was ceremonial. First came scoring the fat in that diamond pattern. Careful cuts that went just through the fat layer without hitting meat. Then the cloves were inserted at each intersection, one by one, creating a geometric design that was as much art as cooking. The pineapple rings came next, each one centered on a diamond and secured with colored toothpicks. Some cooks used maraschino cherries too, placing one in the center of each pineapple ring for extra color. The glaze was painted on with a pastry brush, layers building up during the long baking process, until the ham was encased in a sweet, sticky shell. The elaborately decorated ham has mostly disappeared, replaced by simpler preparations or honey-baked hams purchased from specialty stores. The time required for the clove studding and repeated glazing seems excessive, and younger cooks often skip the decorative elements. But the traditional holiday ham represented abundance, skill, and the importance of presentation. It showed guests they were valued enough to merit hours of preparation and careful attention to appearance. The ham wasn't just food, it was a statement that this celebration mattered, that the family had the resources and expertise to present something truly special. Carving it at the table, revealing the juicy interior beneath that caramelized crust, was a moment of pride and generosity. 19 pecan pie from scratch. Pecan pie made from scratch with homemade crust and filling was a beloved holiday staple in Black households, particularly among families with southern roots where pecan trees were common. This wasn't the overly sweet corn syrup-dominated version that became standard later. It was a more balanced creation with a rich, custardy filling that let the pecans shine. The filling combined eggs, butter, sugar, vanilla, and just enough corn syrup or molasses to bind everything together. Poured into a flaky homemade crust and topped with perfect pecan halves arranged in concentric circles. The pie would bake until the filling was set, but still had a slight wobble in the center, creating that ideal texture. Firm enough to slice, but still creamy and rich. Making pecan pie from scratch required both pastry skills and an understanding of custard-based fillings. The crust had to be rolled thin and fitted carefully into the pie plate without tearing. The filling needed to be mixed gently to avoid incorporating too much air, which could cause cracks. Pecans had to be fresh. Old nuts would be bitter and ruin the entire pie. Many families had their own pecan trees or knew someone who did, and using fresh-picked pecans elevated the pie to something special. The baking required attention. Over-baking would make the filling grainy. Under-baking would leave it runny. Pecan pie is still made today, but most versions rely on store-bought crusts and overly simplified fillings that are basically pure corn syrup. The craft and nuance of the traditional version have been lost. But homemade pecan pie represented Southern heritage and the bounty of the land. It connected Black families to agricultural traditions and to recipes that had been perfected over generations. The time and skill invested in making it properly showed respect for tradition and dedication to quality. A perfect pecan pie was a source of pride, and the baker who could produce one with a flaky crust and perfectly balanced filling earned lasting appreciation. 20. Cornbread dressing with sage. Cornbread dressing, not stuffing, was sacred at Black holiday tables. The distinction mattered deeply. This was never bread cubes from a bag. It was homemade cornbread baked specifically for the dressing, along with biscuits or white bread, all dried out and crumbled, then mixed with sautéed celery, onion, sage, poultry seasoning, and enough broth to make it moist but not soggy. The mixture would be spread in large pans and baked until golden and slightly crispy on top, with a tender, flavorful interior that absorbed gravy beautifully. This was the soul of the holiday meal, the dish that family members requested seconds and thirds of, the one that sparked passionate debates about proper technique. Every family had their secret to perfect dressing. Some added hard-boiled eggs, others included oysters or sausage. The ratio of cornbread to white bread was hotly contested. The amount of sage was carefully guarded information. Some families made their dressing very wet and spoon-able. Others preferred it dry enough to slice. Grandmothers would begin preparing days in advance, baking cornbread and biscuits, letting them dry out properly. On cooking day, they'd taste and adjust, seasoning constantly, adding more broth, more sage, more butter. The dressing had to taste right. It was the benchmark by which the entire meal would be judged. While cornbread dressing still appears at some holiday meals, the from-scratch tradition has eroded. Many families now use packaged cornbread mix or even box stuffing mix, which fundamentally changes the flavor and texture. The deep knowledge of proper preparation, how dry the bread should be, how much broth to add when it's perfectly seasoned, is no longer commonly passed down. But traditional cornbread dressing represented culinary excellence and regional identity. It was proof that a cook knew their craft, understood flavor building, and respected tradition. The dressing was often more important than the turkey itself, and getting it right meant honoring generations of cooks who had perfected the recipe. 21. Banana pudding with vanilla wafers. Banana pudding in black households during the 1970s wasn't the instant pudding version that became common later. It was made with a cooked custard, sliced bananas, and vanilla wafers layered in a glass dish, so everyone could see the beautiful layers. The custard was made from scratch on the stovetop with eggs, milk, sugar, vanilla, and a bit of flour or cornstarch, whisked constantly until it thickened properly. It would be layered while still warm with the cookies and sliced bananas, then topped with meringue that was browned under the broiler or sometimes with whipped cream. The dessert had to be refrigerated for several hours or overnight, allowing the cookies to soften and the flavors to meld together. Making banana pudding was a test of patience and skill. The custard had to be stirred constantly to prevent scorching and to achieve the perfect smooth, thick consistency. The bananas had to be ripe, but not overripe, sliced evenly. The layering required thought, cookies on the bottom, then custard, then bananas, repeating until the dish was full, with careful attention to making it look as good as it tasted. If using meringue, the egg whites had to be beaten to stiff peaks, spread over the pudding, and browned carefully without burning. The finished dessert would chill, transforming into something magical. The cookies soft and cake-like, the custard rich and creamy, the bananas sweet and tender. Banana pudding made with instant pudding or purchased from stores has replaced the traditional version in most households. The cooked custard method takes time and skill that many modern cooks lack or don't want to invest. But the homemade version represented Southern dessert traditions and the pride of presenting something made entirely from scratch. It was a crowd pleaser that showed culinary competence, and it was often the dessert that disappeared first from holiday tables. The glass serving dish was important too. Showing off those perfect layers was part of the appeal. For those who remember, no instant pudding version can match the richness and texture of the traditional banana pudding their grandmothers made. 22. Red rice. Red rice was a staple side dish at holiday meals in many black households, particularly those with Gullah Geechee heritage or connections to South Carolina and Georgia. This wasn't Spanish rice or Mexican rice, it was distinctly African American, made with long grain rice cooked in a rich tomato-based liquid with smoked sausage or bacon, onions, bell peppers, and spices. The rice would simmer slowly until tender, and every grain was infused with the smoky, savory flavors. It came out reddish-brown, fluffy, and deeply flavorful, perfect alongside turkey, ham, or any other holiday protein. Some families made it with chicken stock, others with plain water. But the key was the slow cooking that allowed the flavors to develop fully. Preparing red rice required understanding rice cookery and layering flavors. The meat would be cooked first, rendering its fat and creating a flavorful base. Vegetables would be sautéed until soft, tomato paste or sauce added, and cooked until it deepened in color. The rice would be stirred in, then liquid added. The exact ratio was crucial. Too much and the rice would be mushy, too little and it would burn. The pot would be covered tightly and left to cook undisturbed, though experienced cooks would peek occasionally and adjust heat as needed. When finished, the rice would be fluffy, with each grain separate but fully flavored, and a crispy layer of rice at the bottom of the pot that was prized and fought over. Red rice has become less common on holiday tables, as families have shifted toward plain rice, rice pilaf, or rice mixes. The regional specificity of the dish means it's unfamiliar to many African Americans from other areas, and the cooking technique requires attention and skill. But red rice represented West African culinary heritage filtered through the American South, connecting families to their ancestors and to the Gullah Geechee people who maintained African cooking traditions. It was a dish of resistance and cultural preservation, proof that African American cuisine was diverse and regionally specific, not monolithic. For those whose families served red rice, it was irreplaceable, the taste of home and heritage in every bite. 23. Candied yams with marshmallows. Candied yams with marshmallows topping were a must-have at Black holiday meals during the 1970s, sweet, rich, and almost dessert-like. Fresh sweet potatoes or yams would be peeled, sliced thick, and arranged in layers in a baking dish. Between the layers went a mixture of butter, brown sugar, white sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, vanilla, and sometimes orange juice or pineapple juice. The dish would bake slowly, the sugars creating a thick, bubbling syrup that the potato slices absorbed. Toward the end of baking, miniature marshmallows would be spread over the top and returned to the oven, just long enough to brown and get gooey. The preparation was an exercise in achieving the right balance of sweetness and texture. The potato slices had to be thick enough to hold their shape during long baking, but not so thick they stayed hard. The sugar mixture had to be generous. This dish was meant to be sweet, almost candied. Some cooks added pecans between the layers or sprinkled them on top with the marshmallows. The baking had to be slow enough that the potatoes cooked through and absorbed the syrup without burning. The final product would be bubbling, caramelized around the edges, with those marshmallows creating a golden toasted crown. While candied yams still appear at some holiday meals, many health-conscious families have reduced the sugar dramatically or eliminated the marshmallows entirely, creating a different dish. The ultra-sweet version of the past has fallen out of favor as dietary preferences have changed. But those traditional candied yams represented abundance and celebration. The use of generous amounts of sugar and butter signaled that this was a special occasion, not everyday eating. They were almost a dessert disguised as a side dish, and kids would pile them on their plates happily. For families who remembered times when sugar was a luxury, being able to make yams this sweet and rich was a mark of prosperity and plenty. 24. Green bean casserole, homemade version. The green bean casserole that appeared at Black holiday tables in the 1970s was more elaborate than the standard version popularized by Campbell's. While it did include canned cream of mushroom soup as a base, Black cooks elevated it with fresh touches. Real sautéed mushrooms added for extra flavor, fresh green beans when possible instead of canned, crispy fried onions made from scratch rather than from a can, and sometimes bacon or ham pieces mixed in. The casserole would be assembled in layers, topped generously with the onions or sometimes breadcrumbs mixed with butter, then baked until bubbling and golden on top. Making the elevated version required extra steps that many cooks felt were worth the effort. Fresh green beans would be trimmed and blanched until tender crisp, maintaining their bright color and slight crunch. Onions would be sliced thin, dredged in flour, and fried until crispy and golden. A messy, time-consuming process, but one that produced incomparable flavor and texture. The mushroom sauce would be enriched with sour cream or a splash of sherry, sometimes with garlic or other seasonings added. Everything would be combined carefully, ensuring even distribution of the sauce and vegetables, then topped with those precious homemade fried onions. The fully homemade green bean casserole has become rare as families rely on the quicker, simpler version or skip the dish entirely. The time investment, blanching beans, frying onions, sautéing mushrooms, seems excessive when the canned version takes minutes. But the homemade version represented pride in presentation and refusal to settle for shortcuts when cooking for important occasions. It showed that the cook valued quality and was willing to do extra work to make every dish special. The difference in taste was significant. Fresher, more complex, with better texture. For those who remember, the homemade version was incomparably superior, worth every extra minute of preparation. 25. Baked macaroni and cheese, traditional. Traditional baked macaroni and cheese at Black holiday tables was a serious culinary undertaking. This was never from a box. and it required skill, quality ingredients, and careful attention. The dish started with a proper cheese sauce made from scratch. Butter melted, flour whisked in to make a roux. Then milk added gradually while stirring constantly until smooth and thick. Real cheese was grated by hand, usually a combination of sharp cheddar, mild cheddar, and sometimes Colby or Monterey Jack, and stirred into the sauce until melted. This sauce would be combined with cooked elbow macaroni. The mixture poured into a buttered baking dish, topped with more cheese and sometimes breadcrumbs, then baked until golden and bubbling with crispy edges. The technique was crucial for perfect macaroni and cheese. The pasta had to be slightly undercooked since it would continue cooking in the oven. The cheese sauce needed to be thick enough to coat the pasta, but not so thick it became pasty. The ratio of pasta to sauce was debated. Some families liked it very saucy. Others preferred firmer. Eggs were sometimes added to help the dish set into sliceable portions. The baking had to be just right, hot enough to get those coveted brown edges and top crust, but not so hot that it dried out. When done perfectly, the macaroni and cheese would have a creamy interior and crispy, cheesy top, with those corner pieces that everyone fought over. Boxed macaroni and cheese and even store-bought baked versions have largely replaced the traditional homemade dish. And when people do make from scratch, they often use modern shortcuts like pre-shredded cheese and microwave roux methods. The labor-intensive traditional preparation has fallen out of practice as food culture has shifted toward convenience. But the homemade baked macaroni and cheese represented Southern soul food traditions and the expectation of excellence at holiday meals. It was a mandatory dish, as important as any meat or dessert, and getting it right was non-negotiable. The creamy richness and cheesy perfection with a taste of celebration, comfort, and home. For many people, no holiday meal felt complete without a proper pan of macaroni and cheese made the right way by someone who knew the family's preferred technique. These 25 holiday foods tell a story beyond ingredients and recipes. They chronicle the culinary traditions of Black families during a specific era. Traditions shaped by history, resourcefulness, cultural pride, and the determination to create abundance even when resources were limited. Many of these dishes have faded not because they weren't delicious, but because the skills required to make them properly, the time needed for preparation, and the cultural knowledge they represented are no longer commonly passed down. For those who remember these foods, each dish carries memories of family gatherings, skilled grandmothers, crowded kitchens filled with laughter and good smells, and the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves, a community with its own rich traditions worth preserving and celebrating.